through this discussion, I hope we can bring out what boundaries are really.
I mean, it starts from school and college, and what do you study and where do you study, who do you marry, when do you marry, how do you marry, how are you saving your money, are you having kids, are you not having kids. Very personal decisions to an individual don't remain personal anymore, and that's where I think the whole boundary thing comes up. But I think it also plays out in workspaces, because you've internalized this whole approach of not confronting somebody who is an authority figure because you've never done that.
So, in most Indian families, the concept of boundaries is completely alien. What are boundaries, you may ask? I call them an unwritten yet assumed limit or line that is drawn between people. Now, boundaries may be of different levels. For instance, a personal boundary between me and my loved one may be very different from me and a colleague at work or my neighbor. And I want to welcome here clinical psychologist Dr. Vandita Dubey after a while in this discussion on boundaries on Zen Brain. So thank you very much for joining us, Doc.
Thank you.
And I want to start with the great Indian family where people, especially kids, are expected to say yes to elders without any questions. Otherwise, it's regarded as bad behavior. So being right doesn't matter, really. Being older seems to be the only thing that matters in most. And I say most, but not all Indian families. So what are these boundaries really? What are we talking about? And where do boundaries come into our families?
I think all of us know what boundaries are. In a sense, we use them pretty much every day, right? And it's I think that sense of where this is me and this is somebody else. This is what I want and this is what I don't want. I like this or I don't like this. And boundaries in that sense can be boundaries which are in one's interpersonal space. So whether it's within the family or, like you said, at work, they're different contexts, but those are interpersonal boundaries. And then, you may have boundaries with friends around finances. You could have boundaries around your body and, sex, emotions. You have intellectual boundaries. Of course, all aspects of life, whatever we do and whatever we experience, boundaries come in at some point, because there is this feeling at some point or the other where you feel that I'm not being respected. My ideas are being used by somebody else. I feel like I'm being taken for granted. So this is where boundaries come in.
Doc, I want to read just a little extract from a book that, I read recently. And in fact, we interviewed the author also. It's called Unashamed by Neha Bhatt. She writes, people have been conditioned by their parents that children must have emotional and physical proximity to their parents and families. For them, the word boundary is perceived as threatening because it signifies a wall, and a wall signifies distance. Thus, many Indian parents of an older generation feel attacked when their adult children ask for their valid needs to be met. They hear setting boundaries as my child wants to leave me. I want your point of view on this.
When one talks about boundaries could be a spectrum. So on the one end, you could say there are no boundaries, that you're not setting boundaries around in a particular area of your life or in a particular relationship or whatever. And on the other hand, it could be a wall where you're withdrawing or you're cutting off someone or people or whatever it is, right? And the thing about boundaries is that they're not fixed. They have to be negotiated often. And especially when one is looking at interpersonal relation, when is looking family, they have to be negotiated. It's a human negotiation that happens in all relationships about how much of anything is going to be about me and how much of it is it going to be about you. How much of my needs are going to get met? How much of your needs are going to get met? There is no way to balance it out in a very equal way. How do you figure out where that balance lies? Or how do you figure out, where one person feels that, okay, this is, I'm giving too much, and the other person feels that it's just not enough. Boundaries very much exist within a cultural and social context. And what might be considered healthy boundaries or appropriate boundaries in a family in India might be very different from what's considered appropriate or healthy boundaries somewhere else, like in the West, for example, right? I mean, in the West, you expect that at 18, the child is going to leave home. That doesn't happen in India. I mean, you may be in your 30s or 40s or 50s, and if you're a child, you're still considered a child by your parents, and they will still come and say, why are you going out, and why are you out so late, and you're not giving us time, and so on and so forth. So we come from very different spaces. and very different expectations of what we consider appropriate boundaries. And each family within a social and cultural context also, each family is different.
Each family is different. This is what we need to keep in mind. We can't compare. Through this discussion, I hope we can bring out what boundaries are really. It could be physical boundaries, sexual boundaries, emotional boundaries, psychological, intellectual boundaries. If people grow up without having a sense of what these boundaries really are, how can it affect them as adults?
I think it affects people in many, many different ways. I mean, if we look at a very kind of a stereotypical Indian family, perhaps a patriarchal setup where it's more traditional in terms of who makes the decisions and who follows the decisions and so on and so forth, right? And how it plays out in an adult's life is, I've seen it with young people, actually people of all ages, but it could be something like as fundamental, as basic as, can you go out? Can you go out with your friends on the weekend, or you can't? Or, how do you choose to spend your time, or where do you choose to work? I mean, it starts from school and college, and what do you study and where do you study, who do you marry, when do you marry, how do you marry, how are you saving your money, are you having kids, are you not having kids. Decisions which are very personal decisions to an individual don't remain personal anymore. They become about what other people think and what they think is right for you. And that's where a clash happens between what an individual wants and what is expected, or what is defined as the right thing to do. And that's where I think the whole boundary thing comes up. Who has the right to tell whom about what they should or should not do? Another consequence of it is, of course, it happens in personal life, your personal decisions and all of that, right? But I think it also plays out in workspaces, because you've internalized this whole approach of not confronting somebody who is an authority figure, because you've never done that, right? At home growing up, it's not allowed, it's not accepted. That's not the thing to do. I mean, even now, and when people talk about long work hours and no work-life balance, and that people should in offices speak up and say, okay, we need to go home, or you're not going to work on the weekends. Who's going to say that? It's very hard to challenge authority figures, no matter in what sphere.
Very interesting. I want to dig deeper into this. You get into a mentality of not being allowed to make decisions, and therefore not being able to make decisions when you grow up, believing that you do not have agency. I remember having a conversation with somebody a while ago where they said, I was so busy being the good person, the good son, the good husband, the good father, the good employee, that I forgot to become who I thought I should have been. And that was one of his greatest regrets. I mean, simple things like even having space as a child. We do not think of allowing our kids or the kids to have their own space and not judge them constantly for having a point of view. Even that
Right.
is, maintaining that boundary and allowing them to be. Are you seeing, though, a difference now in what was and what is in your practice?
It's definitely changing in the urban space with people of, like our generation, people younger than us, and when they become parents, there is a difference in the way they approach all of this. Of course, that goes to another also the very typical stereotypical thing about, okay, don't do this, don't do that, or why are you doing this? But it's also, we also get into the whole boundary thing when we are being overprotected. So I will always go and drop you to whatever class. I will always pick you up from there, right? Or what now is often being described as helicopter parenting. That's done in a more positive manner. It's done out of care and concern. Of course, I think the earlier thing was also care and concern, but it was a very different kind of an approach to parenting, which is a very authoritarian kind of a thing, very patriarchal kind of thing. This is a different kind of parenting. But you know what? The end result can sometimes be the same, because it doesn't allow the child to experiment and figure out boundaries. Because like I said, boundaries they're not fixed in time and space. They're not one particular thing that you can measure. Boundaries, it's like titration. You have to figure out where it falls, where in a relationship with a friend or at work or wherever, in each and every space. Where is that boundary between two people? And that has to be worked out. And if you have no practice in working that out, then you can't just suddenly magically start doing it once you've grown up. So the whole thing in boundaries is that, a lot of what we do as parents now, or that parents in the previous generation have done, or that parents like in rural areas or whatever perhaps continue to do, all of that is going to affect boundaries. I mean, there's going to be an impact no matter what. I think wherever children are allowed, given that agency that you talked about a little earlier in terms of being able to take some decisions of their own, because that's where they experiment, that's where they're trying out, that's where they're learning this whole art of creating boundaries, which are neither too rigid so that they cut off people, and or on the other hand, they are so loose that they have no sense of where they are in that relationship.
True, it's true. But again, getting back to the cultural context of it all, I remember having this discussion with my mother, and I said, you need to give me space. I need space. And I remember her telling me this: I'm worried not about you, but about what could happen if you're out late. I got that. So not every parent does it because they want to be an authoritarian figure. They do it out of concern. There are lots of gray areas, and this is why we have candid discussions like these, to discuss those gray areas. I want to get into something called enmeshment. It's really a psychological concept that describes an unhealthy relationship between two or more people where personal boundaries are unclear or non-existent. For example, a mother is totally enmeshed with her child. There's over-involvement and a blurred sense of self. So their entire identity, for instance, is dependent on that relationship. And this is true even in adult love relationships or marriage. So how does one set boundaries in such a case?
There's a couple that's just gotten married, and they're, of course, trying to figure out their own relationship. They're trying to figure out their space and things like that. But there's a lot of involvement from one set of parents or the other set of parents. And it happens, right, that a lot of young couples have of having to deal with in-laws, one side or the other, having somebody call, what are you cooking, cook like this, or what are you wearing, or you should do this, or you should do that, you should be whatever, all of that stuff. See, enmeshment is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. If the enmeshment is between a mother and a daughter who has become an adult now and who has entered her own relationship, the enmeshment could look like the mother and daughter talking about everything all the time. I mean, it's great to have a good mother-daughter relationship, but it's like for all advice, for all emotional support, for the everyday stuff, for the exceptional stuff, for everything, you're going to that one person. And it becomes a little difficult. Now, where do you decide this is a close bond between the mother and daughter, or now that it has become an enmeshed relationship? And that sense of whether it's enmeshed or not will really happen when there is a third person, right? Because these two may never realize that it's an enmeshed relationship. Or perhaps at some point the daughter may realize and she'll start objecting to it and say, okay, I want my freedom, I want my space, I want to decide things on my own and things like that. That may happen.
It's a huge problem, newly married couples and interfering parents from either side. Let's talk about this mother-in-law. Correct me if I'm wrong. One way to actually avoid this interference or setting boundaries is up to the son. However, in a lot of cases, the son steps back and lets the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law handle their own, especially in a patriarchal setup like us. The son needs to create those boundaries with the parents so that he can actually have an independent and healthy boundary-led life with his own family. What I find in my experience is that most sons don't step up. They do not create boundaries with their own parents. It's almost like he's scared to hurt them. You have to build those boundaries even while you're growing up. It may be hurtful to the parents, but they will understand if you communicate. And this is where we come back to. There's barely any communication, healthy communication between families about these trivial issues. We call them trivial, but they end up being massive issues later.
Yes, you're right. That, of course, it's the third person in this case, the example that you're giving. Of course, it's not that the daughter-in-law can create the boundaries, although what does happen is that the daughter-in-law will try to create boundaries, and then that is looked at as a problem, and then that people are upset and things happen. I think for any relationship, especially when we're talking about a romantic relationship or a committed relationship, it is very important for the two people concerned who are in a relationship, in a committed relationship, to create a boundary around themselves. It is to keep the sanctity of that relationship and to keep that specialness of that relationship intact, and not allow, whether it's parents or it's friends or it's work or it's other activities, because then it goes into many zones from where the interference can come in, right? So it is up to the two people concerned to create that boundary around that relationship and do that. The challenge, however, often is, or why people find it difficult to do, is again because, if you haven't done it for so long, doing it becomes very difficult. And yes, whenever you try to create a boundary, whoever is on the other side will feel upset, because you're changing the rules of the relationship. You're changing something in the dynamic. You're saying, okay, fine, now you could call me anytime. Now you can't call me anytime. So there is going to be opposition. There is going to be a reaction on the other side to that, because that's a new way of interacting that now you're setting up. I think the thing is, you're right, that for a lot of parents, and especially in India, and I suppose elsewhere also, but definitely in India, that a lot of this holding on comes from a place of care and concern, yes, but then also from a place of fear.
That's right.
The fear is of losing that connection, losing that relationship, losing your child, right, to this new person. And I think it's important to address that fear. So like I said, boundaries, it's not about creating a wall and keeping people outside. And it's not about, having no clue where you stand in a relationship. But it's somewhere in the middle. And that has to be negotiated. And so part of it is reassuring parents, telling them, okay, no, I'm still connected. I still care. I will meet you. It's not that I'm disappearing, right? It's not that I'm cutting you off.
Relationships evolve from your relationship with your parents when you were children to when you grow up and have other relationships. And you, like you said, you create a boundary in your, love relationship, and the boundary that you create, no one enters. I make it sound like a wall, but it's literally like an invisible line that you create around your relationship, and whatever happens within, and there will be no interference. I find that really a common mistake that people are making in having healthy love relationships. They do not value that relationship. There's so much being said about your partner to other people that there is no respect left in that. Even that is a boundary, right? You have to respect your relationship first. If you can have this healthy form of communication with your spouse and still maintain your own individuality. Again, this is a gray area of what boundaries are. And also, I'm touching upon a very sensitive topic, is what you expect your partner to adhere to. In most marriages and even relationships, this communication has not happened. Right? That I do advise everybody who's thinking about getting married to actually see a couples counselor before they actually get married, because you aren't aware. These things cannot be told to you, but you realize this in the years that pass, after staying with each other, that one person's normal and the other person's normal may be completely different. There's no right and wrong. And this is something I've learned from you, having conversations on Zen Brain. Let's talk about that a little bit. How you need to communicate very clearly what your boundaries are with even your partner, what you expect out of the other person.
So boundaries, okay, so in a relationship, when we're talking about a more long-term or a committed relationship, the whole thing of boundaries will come up at, I guess, two levels: boundaries that each individual has, and their boundaries in terms of what they're comfortable with in terms of, say, physical touch, or what they're comfortable with in terms of, I don't know, social interactions, or what they're comfortable with in terms of finances. So one is that, like you said, everybody's normal is different. And it's almost inevitable that when two people come together, their normals will be different. If not in all areas, but in many areas, they will be different, right? So it is about having conversations and saying, okay, what are you comfortable with? What am I comfortable with? And what can we agree on? And then coming to some kind of an understanding of what those boundaries are going to look like. The other conversation to have is the boundaries around the relationship. One person may have great, very close friendships, for example, right? The other person may not have or may not necessarily be so comfortable with their partner's friends, right? They may not want them living in their house the entire time, right? So again, what does that mean for that particular couple? And what it means for one couple will be very different from what it means to another couple. So it's also because the most important thing is who your partner is and what their normal is, and then the two of you coming together and figuring out what the combined normal is for the two of you. And then communicating that to other people, because that's another important piece. Because like you said earlier, it happens with families, it happens even, I've heard it with friends, people struggle because who's going to communicate that, okay, now there is a bit of a change.
Yeah.
And, one is not going to be available all the time to go out and party and stuff because, one is in a committed relationship now. So how does one deal with that? So a lot of it is really about conversations and talking about, okay, I'm comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with this. What are you comfortable with? What can we agree upon? Right. And then, like I said, it's a negotiation. There is some give and take. Maybe you push yourself a little bit, maybe the other person does. And you find out something which is kind of, midway, which feels okay to both people. I mean, it can't be a perfect thing. There is no one ideal relationship. There's no one way of doing things. There'll be many different ways of doing things. So just finding out. So it's a lot of conversation and feeling okay to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, to talk about it. I know I've done this a lot. I've felt bad about things, but I've let them go. And it's bothered me. It's better that you communicate, but it's also about how it is communicated. This is very important. This is a lifelong learning, even for myself. It's not just about what you communicate, it's how you communicate it to the other person. And it could be a friend. And yes, you're right. There's often a challenge with friends that you have known for donkey's years. So it has to be communicated, but again, without hurting feelings.
The general rule of communication that generally works, that we often forget, is owning up to one's own emotions. And it's human tendency that if it feels like, okay, everything's going fine, why rock the boat? So what happens with a lot of people is that you won't voice something that you're kind of uncomfortable with because you feel, why do that? Things are going okay, but then those little things keep add up, and you tallying. There's a mental tally that's going on in your own head, and at some point the dam breaks, and you're very upset, right? Because it's like, okay, this happened then, and that happened then, and that happened then. Eventually there'll be communication, but the communication comes out in a form of a lot of, you don't do this and you don't do that and you are like this kind of a thing, right? Which is a lot of blame. And of course, when it comes from that place, then the other person gets defensive, and then of course the conversation goes nowhere after that point. So I think the thing is to really bring up these things, even when they seem to be minor, seem to be small. But if you can actually really let it go, then it's fine. But if you find yourself thinking about it in the evening or the next day, then it is something that's there on your mind. So rather than just keeping it in one's mind, it's better to bring it up in a more in a neutral way and say, okay, I've been feeling like this, or I felt like this, and can we do this differently? Or, and also just asking the other person, what is it that you think? I feel this. What do you feel? But I think this. What do you think? How should we handle this? How should we deal with this, right? So then that brings a more of a problem solving approach to the conversation rather than a blame thing. Because when it gets to the blame point, then of course conversations, it's not much productive happens then.
Do you not think it is also our obsession about people pleasing? Number two, the inability to say no. It's almost like you view yourself as a bad person if you say no. But I see the happiest people are people who know how to say no because they've been brought up like that. And I find that they're happier because they're able to express themselves clearly and say, No, I don't like it. Self-awareness comes in over here as well. How aware are you of who you are and how much you're able to express yourself?
I think at the end of the day, it's about sorting through things in one's own mind first. That is a precondition to everything. And it is a precondition to even the whole setting boundaries thing, whether it's in a long-term relationship or it's in any other relationship. So I think awareness and being able to introspect and say, okay, this is this. So what happens is, see, a lot of times, people feel something, a friend did something or didn't do something, and you're feeling bad about it, right? And you're feeling in your own head, you're saying, okay, I keep doing X for my friend, but they never do this for me, whatever it is, right? So that's going on in one's head. You're building that narrative. And the thing is that it's bothering you. There's something there that's bothering you, right? But the thing is, when you look at it, you never really end up talking to the friend because, like you said, you feel that, okay, if you say this, you might hurt the friend. You should not hurt the friend. You'll be a bad person if you hurt somebody, that. Or the fear that, okay, sometimes there's fear also saying, okay, if I say this, then the person will be very upset or mad at me or angry with me, and feeling like you won't be able to handle it. So there are different reasons which prevent one from saying anything. But the thing is that, that just kind of festers and it stays within oneself. Often it's either sometimes a feeling of guilt or a feeling of that what if you hurt somebody. But the thing is, if it's going on in your head, in your mind, it's going on in your mind, and it is there for a reason. Sometimes it's important to look at one's own emotions and feelings as sources of information, and to ask oneself, okay, so what is this feeling telling me? If I'm feeling disappointed, or I'm feeling taken for granted, or I'm feeling upset, what is this feeling telling me? What is it that's not working in this situation? What is it that I need in this situation? And once you sort through it in your own mind, you can communicate it, like you said earlier, you can communicate it in whatever way. It doesn't have to come out as blame or something like that, right? Which can be upsetting to somebody. But if it comes out in a more neutral way, maybe it is something that can be resolved.
I want to make 2 points, and incidentally, both these points have been made by you in a separate discussion. One is that your style of, say, how you handle conflict, or how you are in relationships, right? You show up because a blueprint has been handed to you by the adults you've grown up around. Therefore, that makes your normal very different from another person's normal. It could be another friend, it could be your spouse, it could be your love relationship, whatever. And second is, we are all different kinds of people. Aggressive, some are passive aggressive. So our way of handling conflict is also very different. So you may be two friends, one may be aggressive and one may be passive aggressive. So how you process what you're going through is also completely different. One person may require space. Even these are boundaries that you allow the other person. How do you know even that you have a problem with boundaries?
I think it's just in the way you feel, right? You feel about a particular person, or you feel in a particular situation, or you feel in a particular relationship. It's often, like I said, our feelings are sources of information. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, or if you're feeling, like I said, taken for granted, or you're feeling threatened, encroached upon, or you're feeling disregarded. So whatever you're feeling, your feelings are telling you something. They're telling you that you're not comfortable. It's important then to pay attention, because there's something happening there, and one can often, put it in the context of boundaries and say, okay, this is what is. It's for example, something like, a friend who always borrows but never pays back, or is forever postponing that. And that's also a boundary that the friend is crossing. And you may feel uncomfortable about it, right? You may feel bad confronting the friend. You may like the friend may be wonderful otherwise, but this is a boundary that they're crossing. And it is a gray area, right? Because there, how do you bring up a conversation? So then that'll depend a lot about values. Some people are very clear about money stuff, and they have no other emotions surrounding it, and they'll be very transactional about it and very clear, and that's it. And there'll be other people who'll spend nights agonizing, losing their sleep, not knowing how to ask somebody for the money that they borrowed that they've never returned, right? Kind of a thing. Again, your emotions are going to tell you that something's not right here in this relationship or in this situation, and something needs to be done. So I guess it's about paying attention, like you said earlier, sorting through one's own head, paying attention to one's feelings, not minimizing, not ignoring, not judging oneself, because there are also people who judge themselves, say, oh, okay, but what a money-minded person I am that I'm worrying about this. The point is, if you are worrying about it, you are worrying about it.
Friends borrowing money. If it happens once, it is likely to happen again. So those boundaries need to be set, whatever the case. Number two is also respecting yourself in the process. How much can you give in?
There is great space for generosity. There is great space for giving without expecting something in return. But in all of that, I think like you said, what you have to be mindful of is, why are you doing it? Are you doing it from a place of saying, okay, I'm doing it because it's okay, I'm not really expecting anything in return. It's fine for me to do it. That's perfectly fine. Then it's nobody's business to tell you that you're being foolish, because that also happens sometimes, and it's difficult because somebody's ideas of what that boundary should look like might be very different from yours. However, if it's making you uncomfortable, if you are thinking about it, if you are losing any sleep over it, then of course it's not something that you're okay with. That is a situation where it's important to kind of say something, do something. Like you said, yes, it is a lot easier when you do set those boundaries right from the beginning, because that sets the tone for future interactions, and it becomes a lot easier too, because then the other person also knows what to expect or what not to expect from you, and things are clear. It is a lot harder when you have been giving in whichever sphere of life for a while, and then you change it. It does cause discomfort. There will be pushback, like I said before, but it is something that's important, and you need to do it. Whenever you wake up to it, you need to do it, basically.
I want to bring up something very important. Also, when people, in order to protect their own boundaries, end up breaching the other's boundary.
Do you have something in mind when you say that?
Say an individual who do not wish to be called at a certain time or do things on these days, they assume that you will be available.
It is about needs and expectations. Sure, if they are setting those boundaries, you also have every right to set your own boundaries, right? So if it doesn't work for you to be available whenever it's fine for the other person, and otherwise, so then that's the space where some of that negotiation needs to happen. What's assumed in this is that it is a somewhat equal relationship. If there's a power dynamic there for whatever reasons, then it's a lot harder to negotiate that boundary then.
That's a very important point. When it's a power equation, then it's tougher to do, for instance, like a boss and an employee. And in terms of parents as well, in terms of elders in the family and you.
See, so there are two things, right, that happen. One is when you have to negotiate boundaries. One is that there'll be potentially consequences to trying to create that boundary. Now, the consequences could be very real and very substantial, right? If it's a work situation or whatever, right? You say, okay, no, I'm not available on weekends, and that's just how the place works. Then, 2 weeks in, they'll say, okay, sorry, then we can't have you work for us. And that happens. And that's the reality of things. If that's the reality of things, then of course, you really have to look at, okay, you have to be mentally prepared. I mean, you can still set the boundary as long as you're mentally prepared for whatever the consequences. But the other thing is that sometimes it's fear that stops us from setting boundaries. Fear is often around, it can be about actual real consequences, or it can be about more of imagined consequences, or it could be, of, okay, so-and-so will be upset, or, they will not like it, or they will judge me, or I will make them feel bad. There again, it's about, you have to evaluate how willing are you to face those consequences. But if it is more of a fear or an imagined fear, or even a fear of emotions, of somebody's emotional reaction, then again, you have to really look at it and say, okay, fine, okay, worst case, yes, the person will be upset, but most likely you can work through that, or they'll be upset for a little while and then they will get used to it, which is what happens often, that people may be upset initially, but you can work through it and they will get used to the new boundary as long as they feel that there is some negotiation, there's some room to talk about it and to find space.
It's all about actually just getting to know yourself a little better, what bothers you, what you are okay with, and what's feeling right to you and what feels wrong. And when it feels wrong, do something about it. As simple as that, you'll be happier. This thing that we are conditioned with, concept of people pleasing, somehow we are not nice people or good people if we say no. That needs to change. You need to value yourself first. Although this generation seems to take it to another level, this whole concept of, oh, I can't work on weekends, and that is non-negotiable. However, we come from a generation where work ethic meant something. And there are lots of people who are troubled by this. I know companies that are deeply affected by this lack of work ethic, which is then passed off as boundaries. How does one negotiate that?
I mean, rather than it be like a general statement or about everyone in this generation, it is about work ethic. It is about setting boundaries. The other thing to really think about is the larger context of what's going on, right? And the larger context of what expectations are. And what is this a reaction to? And what's happening overall in their lives, in the lives of the young people that we're talking about. What motivates them? What do they aspire for? Do they have a sense of belonging somewhere? A lot of these things play into the whole thing of work ethic. A lot of it plays into the thing of, okay, we're talking about boundaries. We are still talking about boundaries. It's a weekend. Yes, you have the right to take the time off, but yes, you may be willing to come in. Or can we talk about when is it when you can come in, and when is it that the organization is just taking for granted that you'll be working all the time, right? So it's also both sides, right? It's a negotiation even there. Do those negotiations happen? I don't have the answers.
Boundaries are invisible lines, as we talked about, and they need to be negotiated in every relationship uniquely. For instance, the boundary that you and I set will be very different from the boundary that one sets with one's friends, spouses, or one's parents. I want to end with a quote from Boundaries is Equal to Freedom by Joseph Newgan. Love yourself enough to set boundaries. Do not expect those who do not love themselves enough to set and honor their boundaries to understand yours. At least we are talking about things that can't be explained otherwise, except through life examples, because these are very, very important life skills. And thank you for helping us negotiate this very interesting topic called boundaries today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion.